Are we here? Are we live? Hello, testing. Hello. Okay, it says that we're live now. That's kind of wonderful. I I do apologize to anyone who expects me to be prompt. Tonight we did have some issues connecting. So if you don't expect me to be prompt, then good. You've obviously come to know me quite well. Let's see. Where did we leave off? I'm just going to pick up right here because this seems as good of a spot as any. So the last that we started, we are reading Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. I really wish that I could start this over, but we're already here. And there's already been a murder of a family by a man named Jack, and we're not sure why. And there was a baby who escaped and made it to a cemetery where these ghosts have decided that they're going to take care of this baby. And that is where we are. Okay, we did finish this page. Okay, and I'm going to do my best to redo the accents that, that we started with. We're going to try for consistency. Well, why not? This is Mrs. Owens. It isn't the first time we'd given the freedom of the graveyard to an outsider. That is true, said Caius Pompeius. But he wasn't alive. And with that, the stranger realized that he was being drawn, like it or not, into the conversation, and, reluctantly, he stepped out of the shadow from them like a patch of darkness. No, he agreed. I am not. But I take Mrs. Owen's point. Josiah Worthington said, You do, Silas. I do. For good or for evil, and I firmly believe that it is for good. Mrs. Owens and her husband have taken this child under their protection. It is going to take more than just a couple of gold-hearted souls to raise this child. It will, said Silas, take a graveyard. And what of food? And the rest of it? I can leave the graveyard and return. I can bring him food, said Silas. It's all very well you saying that, said Mother Slaughter, but you comes and you goes and nobody keeps track of you. If you went off for a week, the boy could die. You're a wise woman, said Silas. I see why they speak so highly of you. He couldn't push the minds of the dead as he could the living, but he could use all of the tools of flattery and persuasion he possessed, for the dead are not immune to either. Then he came to a decision. Very well. If Mr. and Mrs. Owens will be his parents, I shall be his guardian. I shall remain here, and if I need to leave, I shall ensure that someone takes my place, bringing the child food and looking after him. We can use the crypt of the chapel, he added. But, expostulated Josiah Worthington, but a human child, a living child? I mean, this is a graveyard, not a nursery, blast it. Exactly, said Silas, nodding. Very good point, Sir Josiah. I couldn't have put it better myself. And for that reason, if for no other, it is vital that the child be raised with as little disruption as possible to the if you'll forgive the expression, the life of the graveyard. With that he strolled over to Mrs. Owens, and he looked down at the infant asleep in her arms. He raised an eyebrow. Does he have a name, Mrs. Owens? Not that his mother told me, she said. Well then, said Silas, his old name won't be of much use to him now, anyway. There are those out there who mean him harm. Suppose we pick a name for him, eh? Caius Pompeius stepped over and eyed the child. He looks a little like my proconsul, Marcus. We could call him Marcus. Josiah Worthington said, He looks more like my head gardener, Stebbins. Not that I'm suggesting Stebbins is a name the man drank like a fish. He looks like my nephew Harry, said Mother Slaughter, and it seemed then as if the whole graveyard was about to join in, each inhabitant offering his or her own comparisons between the infant and someone long forgotten, when Mrs. Owens broke in. He looks like nobody but himself, said Mrs. Owens firmly. He looks like nobody. Then nobody it is, said Silas. Nobody Owens. It was then that, as if responding to the name, the child opened its eyes wide in wakefulness. It stared around it, taking in the faces of the dead and the mist and the moon. Then it looked at Silas. Its gaze did not flinch. It looked grave. And what kind of name is nobody? Asked Mother Slaughter, scandalized. His name, and a good name, Silas told her. It will help to keep him safe. I don't want trouble, said Josiah Worthington. The infant looked up at him, and then, hungry or tired or simply missing his home, his family, his world, he screwed up his tiny face and began to cry. Leave us, said Caius Pompeius to Mrs. Owens. We will discuss this further without you. Mrs. Owens waited outside the funeral chapel. It had been decreed over 40 years before that the building, in appearance a small church with a spire, was a listed building of historical interest. The town council had decided that it would cost too much to renovate it, a little chapel in an overgrown graveyard that had already become unfashionable. So they had padlocked it and waited for it to fall down. Ivy covered it, but it was solidly built, and it would not fall down this century. The child had fallen asleep in Mrs. Owens' arms. She rocked it gently, sang to it an old song, one her mother had sung to her when she was a baby herself, back in the days when men had first started to wear powdered wigs. The song went. You know what? I don't love songs in books. All right. I was trying to see if it rhymes, see if there's any kind of like rhyme scheme, because if it doesn't rhyme, I can't. Sleep, my little Barbie-o, sleep until you waken. When you're grown, you'll see the world, if I'm not mistaken. Kiss a lover, dance a measure, find your name and buried treasure. And Mrs. Owens sang all that before she discovered that she had forgotten how the song ended. That wasn't that bad. She had a feeling that the final line was something in the way of, and some hairy bacon. But that might have been another song altogether, so she stopped, and instead she sang him the one about the man in the moon who came down too soon. And after that she sang in her warm country voice a more recent song about a lad who put in his thumb and pulled out a plum, and she had just started a long ballad about a young country gentleman whose girlfriend had, for no particular reason, poisoned him with a dish of spotted eels, when Silas came around the side of the chapel carrying a cardboard box. "Here we go, Mistress Owens," he said. "Lots of good things for a growing boy. We can keep it in the crypt, eh?" The padlock fell off in his hand, and he pulled open the iron door. Mrs. Owens walked inside, looking dubiously at the shelves and at the old wooden pews tipped up against a wall. There were mildewed boxes of old parish records in one corner, and an open door that revealed a Victorian flush toilet and a basin, with only a cold tap in the other. The infant opened his eyes and stared. "We can put the food here," said Silas. "It's cool, and the food will keep longer." He reached into the box, pulled out a banana. "And what would that be when it was at home?" asked Mrs. Owens, eyeing the yellow and brown object suspiciously. "It's a banana, a fruit from the tropics. I believe you peel off the outer covering," said Silas. "Like so." The child, nobody, wriggled in Mrs. Owens' arms, and she let it down to the flagstones. It toddled rapidly to Silas, grasped his trouser leg, and held on. Silas passed it the banana. Mrs. Owens watched the boy eat. "Banana," she said dubiously. "Never heard of them." "Never. What's it taste like?" "I've absolutely no idea," said Silas, who consumed only one food, and it was not bananas. "You could make up a bed in here for the boy, you know." "I'll do no such thing. With Owens and me having a little tomb over by the daffodil patch. Plenty of room in there for a little one. Anyway," she added, concerned that Silas might think she was rejecting his hospitality, "I wouldn't want the lad disturbing you." "He wouldn't." The boy was done with his banana. What he had not eaten was now smeared over himself. He beamed, messy and apple-cheeked. "Na, he said happily. "What a clever little thing he is," said Mrs. Owens. "And such a mess he's made. Why, I tend you, little wriggler." And she picked the lumps of banana from his clothes and his hair. And then, "What do you think they'll decide?" "I don't know." "I can't give him up. Not after what I promised his mamma." "Although I've been a great many things in my time," said Silas, "I've never been a mother, and I do not plan to begin now. But I can leave this place." Mrs. Owens said simply, "I cannot. My bones are here, and so are Owens's. I'm never leaving." "It must be good," said Silas, "to have somewhere that you belong. Somewhere that's home." There was nothing wistful in the way he said this. His voice was drier than deserts, and he said it as if he were simply stating something unarguable. Mrs. Owens did not argue. "Do you think we'll have long to wait?" "Not long," said Silas, but he was wrong about that. Up in the amphitheater on the side of the hill, the debate continued, that it was the Owenses who had got involved in this nonsense rather than some flibbertigibbet Johnny-come-latelys counted for a lot, for the Owenses were respectable and respected. That Silas had volunteered to be the boy's guardian had weight. Silas was regarded with a certain wary awe by the graveyard folk, existing as he did on the borderland between their world and the world they had left. But still, a graveyard is not normally a democracy, and yet death is the great democracy, and each of the dead had a voice and an opinion as to whether the living child should be allowed to stay, and they were each determined to be heard that night. It was late autumn when the daybreak was long in coming. Although the sky was still dark, cars could now be heard starting up further down the hill, and as the living folk began to drive to work through the misty night-black morning, the graveyard folk talked about the child that had come to them and what was to be done. 300 voices. 300 opinions. Nehemiah Trott, the poet from the tumbled northwestern side of the graveyard, had begun to declaim his thoughts on the matter, although what they were no person listening could have said when something happened, something to silence each opinionated mouth, something unprecedented in the history of the graveyard. A huge white horse, of the kind that the people who know horses would call a gray, came ambling up the side of the hill. The pounding of its hooves could be heard before it was seen, along with the crashing it made as it pushed through the little bushes and thickets, through the brambles and the ivy and the gorse that had grown up on the side of the hill. The size of a shire horse it was, a full 19 hands or more. It was a horse that could have carried a knight in full armor into combat, but all it carried on its naked back was a woman, clothed from head to foot in gray. Her long skirt and her shawl might have been spun out of old cobwebs. Her face was serene and peaceful. They knew her, the graveyard folk, for each of us encounters the lady on the gray at the end of our days, and there is no forgetting her. The horse paused beside the obelisk. In the east, the sky was lightening gently, a pearlish pre-dawn luminescence that made the people of the graveyard uncomfortable and made them think about returning to their comfortable homes. Even so, not a one of them moved. They were watching the lady on the gray, each of them half excited, half scared. The dead are not superstitious, not as a rule, but they watched her as a Roman augur might have watched the sacred crows circle, seeking wisdom, seeking a clue. And she spoke to them in a voice like the chiming of 100 tiny silver bells. I don't know how I'm supposed to imitate that, but we're going to do the best we can. She said only, "The dead should have charity." And she smiled. The horse, which had been contentedly ripping up and masticating a clump of thick grass, stopped then. The lady touched the horse's neck, and it turned. It took several huge, clattering steps, and then it was off the side of the hill and cantering across the sky. Its thunderous hooves became an early rumble of distant thunder, and in moments it was lost to sight. That, at least, was what the folk of the graveyard who had been on the hillside that night claimed had happened. The debate was over and ended, and without so much as a show of hands had been decided. The child called Nobody Owens would be given the freedom of the graveyard. Mother Slaughter and Josiah Worthington Bart accompanied Mr. Owens to the crypt of the old chapel, and they told Mrs. Owens the news. She seemed unsurprised by the miracle. "That's right," she said. "Some of them don't have ha'porth of sense in their heads, but she does. Of course she does." Before the sun rose on a thundering gray morning, the child was fast asleep in the Owens' fine little tomb, for Master Owens had died the prosperous head of the local cabinet makers' guild, and the cabinet makers had wanted to ensure that he was properly honored. Silas went out for one final journey before the sunrise. He found the tall house on the side of the hill, and he examined the 3 bodies he found there, and he studied the pattern of the knife wounds. When he was satisfied, he stepped out into the morning's dark, his head churning with unpleasant possibilities, and he returned to the graveyard, to the chapel spire where he slept, and waited out the days. In the little town at the bottom of the hill, the man Jack was getting increasingly angry. The night had been one that he had been looking forward to for so long, the culmination of months, of years of work, and the business of the evening had started so promisingly. 3 people down before any of them had even had a chance to cry out. And then Then it had all gone so maddeningly wrong. Why on earth had he gone up the hill when the child had so obviously gone down the hill? By the time he had reached the bottom of the hill, the trail had gone cold. Someone must have found the child, taken it in, hidden it. There was no other explanation. A crack of thunder rang out loud and sudden as a gunshot, and the rain began in earnest. The man Jack was methodical, and he began to plan his next move, the calls he would need to pay on certain of the townsfolk, people who would be his eyes and ears in the town. He did not need to tell the convocation he had failed. Anyway, he told himself, edging under a shop front as the morning rain came down like tears, he had not failed. Not yet. Not for years to come. There was plenty of time. Time to tie up this last piece of unfinished business. Time to cut the final thread. It was not until the police siren sounded and first a police car, then an ambulance, then an unmarked police car with a siren blaring sped past him on their way up the hill that reluctantly the man Jack turned up the collar of his coat, put his head down, and walked off into the morning. His knife was in his pocket, safe and dry inside its sheath, protected from the misery of the elements. Okay, and here we have an arch of some sort, a gate, probably in the graveyard. Where are we? Should we start chapter 2? I say yes. I say we just go for it. Here's a drawing of a... Is it nobody? Is that nobody Owens? Lonely out by the graveyard? Chapter 2. The New Friend. Bod was a quiet child with sober gray eyes and a mop of tousled, mouse-colored hair. Really quick, I just read about gray eyes recently. Only 3% of the population is said to have them, and they can masquerade as blue or green. The more you know. He was, for the most part, obedient. He learned how to talk, and once he had learned, he would pester the graveyard folk with questions. "Why am I allowed up the graveyard?" he would ask. Or, "How do I do what he just did?" Or, "Who lives in here?" The adults would do their best to answer his questions, but their answers were often vague or confusing or contradictory, and then Bod would walk down to the old chapel and talk to Silas. He would be there waiting at sunset just before Silas awakened. His guardian could always be counted upon to explain matters clearly and lucidly and as simply as Bod needed in order to understand. "You aren't allowed out of the graveyard. It's aren't, by the way, not amped, not these days, because it's only in the graveyard that we can keep you safe. This is where you live, and this is where those who love you can be found. Outside would not be safe for you. Not yet." "You go outside. You go outside every night." "I am infinitely older than you, lad, and I am safe wherever I am." "I'm safe there too." "I wish that were true, but as long as you stay here, you are safe." Or, "How could you do that? Some skills can be attained by education, and some by practice, and some by time. Those skills will come if you study. Soon enough, you will master fading and sliding and dream-walking. But some skills cannot be mastered by the living, and for those you must wait a little longer. Still, I do not doubt that you will acquire even those in time. You were given the freedom of the graveyard, after all," Silas would tell him. My goodness, that came out of nowhere. "So the graveyard is taking care of you. While you are here, you can see in the darkness. You can walk some of the ways that the living should not travel. The eyes of the living will slip from you. I, too, was given the freedom of the graveyard, although in my case it comes with nothing but the right of abode." "I want to be like you," said Bod, pushing out his lower lip. "No," said Silas firmly, "you do not." Or, Who lies there? You know, Bod, in many cases it is written on the stone. Can you read yet? Do you know your alphabet? My what? Silas shook his head, but said nothing. Mr. and Mrs. Owens had never been much for reading when they were alive, and there were no alphabet books in the graveyard. The next night, Silas appeared at the front of the Owens' cozy tomb, carrying 3 large books, 2 of them brightly colored alphabet books. A is for apple, B is for ball, and a copy of The Cat in the Hat. He also had paper and a packet of wax crayons. Then he walked Bod around the graveyard, placing the boy's small fingers on the newest and clearest of the headstones and the plaques, and taught Bod how to find the letters of the alphabet when they appeared, beginning with the sharp steeple of the capital A. Silas gave Bod a quest to find each of the 26 letters in the graveyard, and Bod finished it proudly with the discovery of Ezekiel Olmsley's stone built into the side of the wall in the old chapel. His guardian was pleased with him. Every day Bod would take his paper and crayons into the graveyard, and he would copy names and words and numbers as best he could, and each night before Silas would go off into the world, Bod would make Silas explain to him what he had written, and make him translate the snatches of Latin which had, for the most part, baffled the Owenses. A sunny day. Bumblebees explored the wildflowers that grew in the corner of the graveyard, dangling from the gorse and the bluebells, droning their deep, lazy buzz, while Bod lay in the spring sunlight watching a bronze-colored beetle wandering across the stone of Georeader, his wife Dorcas, and their son Sebastian, fidelis ad mortem. Bod had copied down their inscription, and now he was only thinking about the beetle when somebody said, "Boy, what are you doing?" Bod looked up. There was someone on the other side of the gorse bush, watching him. "Nothing," said Bod. He stuck out his tongue. The face on the other side of the gorse bush crumpled into a gargoyle, tongue sticking out, eyes popping, then returned to girl. "That was good," said Bod, impressed. "I can make really good faces," said the girl. "Look at this one." She pushed her nose up with one finger, creased her mouth into a huge, satisfied smile, squinted her eyes, puffed out her cheeks. "Do you know what that was?" "No." "It was a pig, silly." "Oh," Bod thought. "You mean like P is for pig?" "Of course, like that. Hang on." She came around the gorse bush and stood next to Bod, who got to his feet. She was a little older than he was, a little taller, and was dressed in bright colors, yellow and pink and orange. Bod in his gray winding sheet felt dowdy and drab. "How old are you?" said the girl. "What are you doing here? Do you live here? What's your name?" "I don't know," said Bod. "You don't know your name?" said the girl. "Of course you do. Everybody knows their own name, fibber." "I know my name," said Bod, "and I know what I'm doing here. But I don't know the other things you said." "How old are you?" Bod nodded. "Well," "Oh, wrong question. How old you are?" Bod nodded. "Well," said the girl, "what was you when you was last birthday?" "I didn't," said Bod. "I never was." "Everybody gets birthdays. You mean they never had cake or candles or stuff?" Bod shook his head. The girl looked sympathetic. "Poor thing." "I'm 5. I bet you're 5 too." Bod nodded enthusiastically. He was not going to argue with his new friend. She made him happy. Her name was Scarlet Amber Perkins, she told him, and she lived in a flat with no garden. Her mother was sitting on a bench by the chapel at the bottom of the hill, reading a magazine, and she had told Scarlet to be back in half an hour and get some exercise, and not to get into trouble or talk to strangers. "I'm a stranger," pointed out Bod. "You're not," she said definitely. "You're a little boy." And then she said, "And you're my friend." so you can't be a stranger. Bod smiled rarely, but he smiled then, hugely and with delight. I'm your friend, he said. What's your name? Bod. It's short for nobody. She laughed then. Funny sort of name, she said. What are you doing now? ABCs, said Bod. From the stones. I have to write them down. Can I do it with you? For a moment, Bod felt protective. The gravestones were his, weren't they? And then he realized how foolish he was being, and he thought that there were things that might be more fun in the sunlight with a friend. He said, yes. They copied down names from tombstones, Scarlet helping Bod pronounce unfamiliar names and words, Bod telling Scarlet what the Latin meant if he already knew, and it seemed much too soon when they heard a voice further down the hill shouting, Scarlet! And that's it. We're at 30 minutes. That is all the time that we have, all the reading we have time for this evening. Let's see, where is the next? We've got a ways to go. Anyway, okay, I love it. So now we've made a friend. And we're guessing that Bod is about 5. So 5 years have passed. And Jack must still be looking for him. So that'll come back. Wow. I love it. I absolutely love it. Well, that concludes our reading for this evening. Thank you so much for joining me, as usual. I'm wearing my sparkly ears today. Do you see this? And I'll see you next Tuesday for episode 31 of Tuesday's Tales of Terror. And as always, stay spooky. Peace. Love. Mwah. Get out of here. Get off my garden patch.